And if I could ask Reverend Sutton and then Mr. Coates to maybe address that.
Thank you. Those issues are linked. We have to make a distinction between personal responsibility and social responsibility. I go into the high schools in Baltimore as well, and we even sponsor programs to convince high schoolers, you can do this, you can succeed, you can make it. That's personal responsibility. But when you go in the schools and you see the conditions, you see the quality of the teaching and all that, you know that they don't have the same shot as those who live 10 miles away or 5 miles away in their school systems. And so one of the roles of the Congress is to make sure that there is a corporate responsibility that we all have for all of our citizens. We can all celebrate the tremendous strides that have been made in racial attitudes in this country. We're proud of the accomplishments of many African American individuals. I'm proud of my accomplishments. I've worked very hard, and my brothers and sisters. But for the millions of descendants of slaves who are trapped in this pernicious cycle of hopelessness, poverty, and rage due to their real experience of inequities, segregation, inferior schools, redlining, and the like, the widespread assumption that everyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps is a lie. It's a falsehood. And that is one of the things that this legislation wants to address. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Coates?
I think, frankly, and this is going to get repetitive, it comes back to the weight of history. I heard it said just earlier, for instance, that the matters which face us today have nothing to do with strangers from 200 years ago. That's not the attitude we take towards George Washington. That's not the attitude we take towards Abraham Lincoln. We take that attitude to history that we're ashamed of. We don't take that attitude towards history that we're proud of. Again, as I said earlier, answering another question, that one of the great weights of 250 years of enslavement in this country, which is longer than the 150 years of freedom that African Americans have enjoyed, is the codification of the idea of inferiority among black people, and not just in the culture, but in the very laws themselves. And even after those laws are repealed, as well they should, the idea still remains and is passed on. And so, for instance, it was just said by one of my fellow committee members that there is a difference between the incomes of Caribbean black immigrants and native blacks. This is true. It's also quite understandable. People who come to America to pursue opportunity generally tend to do better than the masses of a whole group that have been here. This is true of all immigrants, so this is not particularly surprising. But what happens when you look at that second generation? What happens when you look at that third generation of Caribbean blacks? In fact, unlike all other groups, they quickly become African American blacks in terms of their other statistics. Why is that? It's the weight of history. It's the implicit idea that is codified in our laws, in our criminal justice system, in the very places that we live to this very day. There is no way to get out of this. There is no way of escaping this without a direct confrontation, without HR40, the very reason we're here.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. Before I go to my
mission, racism, and where we are today.
Sure. I think the consistent point from the comments that, you just made, an article you just read from, stretching all the way back to the period of enslavement in this country, is the idea of theft. Enslavement is theft. 250 years, black people had the fruits of their labor stolen from them. We don't often think about Jim Crow and the era of segregation as theft, but it's theft too. If I agree to pay taxes, if I agree to fealty to a government, and you give me a different level of resources out of that tax pool, if you've given me a different level of protection, you have effectively stolen from me. If you deny my ability to vote and to participate in the political process, to decide how those resources are used, you have effectively stolen from me. And so it makes a kind of sense that after a period that begins in 1619 of theft, ending conservatively in 1968, I think I'd get an argument on that, but conservatively in 1968, that if you steal from a group of people over that longer period of time, you will have the very wealth gap that Dr. Malveaux resulted from. I think it's very, very important to bring that into the conversation because this wasn't a passive discrimination. This was appropriating resources from one group and giving them to the other through the auspices of the state.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am.
Sure, as I was saying earlier, it's like any other injury. There is the primary effect of the injury, and then there's the secondary and tertiary effects of that injury. African Americans have a history of segregation in this country. What that means is not merely living separately from whites. It means living separately from whites for the explicit purposes of denying certain benefits and certain funding and certain resources to black people. In the case of the housing history in the 20th century, what that meant was that for long periods of time, while this country was making making available to middle-class and working-class white families low-interest loans, the possibility of home ownership, which had not been available in the previous preceding decades, black people were completely cut out of that process. But still there was that dream of buying a home. And so what that gap left was for predatory lending to come in, illegitimate lending that did not enjoy the imprimatur or the backing of the FHA, to come into black neighborhoods and make loans under conditions that were, to say the least, onerous. In some cases, black folks didn't even actually own the homes. This practice of, sure.
Contract lending.
Contract lending, yes.
Could you give us a quick definition of that?
The basic idea of contract lending is because I don't have access to the normal routes of banking to buy a home. And so a contract lender comes in and pretends to actually sell me the home and gives me all the responsibilities of the homeowner, the upkeep, the maintenance, the taxes, et cetera, but actually holds on to the deed. It's a high-tech, rent as you buy rent option.
And the other practice that Wells Fargo participated in a huge way in the early 2000s, 2005, as quoted by a former Wells Fargo loan officer. They went into black communities, particularly through their churches, and pushed subprime lending mortgages on those folks who would have qualified likely for regular mortgages. And she said, we went right after them. She's a former member of Wells Fargo. Wells Fargo Mortgage had an emerging market unit and specifically targeted black churches because it figured church leaders had a lot of influence and we could convince Congress to take subprime loans. That's recent. That's ongoing kinds of stuff. That's egregious. So anybody says this is a thing of the past just isn't paying attention.
Yes, Congressman, just really quick. The reason why I just keep insisting on history is the very fact that that group of people was vulnerable in the first place is because of redlining and Jim Crow. They never would have been in that position if not for history.
And I apologize, but Ms. Brown, if you don't mind, I'm from Pennsylvania, so suburban Philadelphia. If you could talk about that notion of liberation as a result of looking at your own history. Can you tell us what that felt like and why we should argue that for us and paint that picture?
Thank you so much. There's so many layers to it. The part of what hasn't been mentioned today is the fact that race is a fiction. So slavery, the very concept of race and of one race being superior to another was invented to justify slavery. And it was also deployed in order to have white working class, like indentured servants back in Virginia in the colonial era, identify with this notion of whiteness and with wealthier whites rather than identify with enslaved Africans and Native people with whom they had common cause. And so there's a lot of layers to this history that I think for a lot of the white Americans who feel like this is just an accusation and this is just yet another case of calling their people historically racist or calling them racist today. In my experience, the African American community is much more sophisticated about understanding that some of these dynamics, for example, with the GI Bill and whatnot, it's mundane complicity of white folks who are benefiting from a system and looking the other way. They're not necessarily getting up in the morning and saying, I want to be racist. And there's an understanding of that amongst those of us who are in the field doing this work. So they're just, again, coming back to the learning of the history. It's liberatory to get beyond even the very concept of race.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm over.
Thank you, Ms. Dean. Ms. Sylvia, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I want to thank the chairman for bringing this